Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. I'm the co-host, Daniel McAdams. Dr. Paul is traveling. He's speaking at his old alma mater, Gettysburg College, tonight, so I have the reins today. Today we're going to be talking about something that is in the news. It's been covered extensively in both the U.S. and the international news, and that is the situation in Aleppo. We've talked about this before, but as things get more and more serious, there is a need to revisit the topic, I think, and give some updates. But I am very fortunate today to have a special guest, Vanessa Beeley. She is an independent investigative journalist and photographer. And unlike most of the people who will spout off about what's going on in Syria and Aleppo, she actually just returned from there as an investigative reporter. So Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to come on.
Maybe if you don't mind giving our viewers just a couple of words about your background, where you come from, what you do, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. I'm British born. My father was a British diplomat, British ambassador to the Middle East throughout most of his career. That's what gave me the interest in the Middle East. I spent some time in Gaza as a peace activist, lived there in 2012 through the Israeli bombing campaign at the end of 2012. And then obviously developed an interest in writing about my experience, which led to my being involved with various organizations that are covering the Syria crisis as independent investigative analysts and researchers. I write predominantly for 21st Century Wire, and the articles have also been published at Mint Press.
Good, that's great. Well, I don't need to tell you that this has been a really dramatic week when it comes to Syria and Aleppo. We saw yesterday the State Department spokesman John Kirby. He warned the Russians that if they continue fighting and assisting the Syrian government, more Russian lives will be lost, more Russian planes will be shot down. A very chilling thing for him to say. He said Russians will be coming home in body bags. It sounds like a threat, and you might just say it's typical of John Kirby's blowhard style of speaking. But when you couple that with the fact that during the ceasefire that lasted about a week and ended a few days ago, the U.S. and its allies were shipping literally tons of anti-aircraft rockets to their rebels in and around Aleppo. You could see a situation where you would have a Russian plane shot down with American-provided missiles, U.S. and U.K.-provided missiles. That is very, very frightening. Kirby also said, John Kerry said that the U.S. would suspend cooperation with the Russians unless the attacks on eastern Aleppo cease. We hear a lot about Aleppo in the media in the U.S., and Vanessa, I know you won't be shocked to hear that the U.S. mainstream media gets it all wrong. I'm going to read a couple of headlines that I just pulled at random from today, and then I'm going to toss it back to you to let me know whether these are right or wrong. Here's the Washington Post, the paper of record for Washington, D.C. Darkness and fear in Aleppo as the bombs rain down. Washington Times, U.S. pressed to prevent Aleppo bloodbath as residents sit in their homes waiting to die. New York Times, Vladimir Putin's outlaw state. New York Times, the brutal strategy behind Russia's massacres in Syria. That's a little flavor of our media over here, Vanessa. How accurate is that in your experience? You just returned from a trip to Aleppo.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing such an amplification of this anti-Russia, anti-Syria propaganda right now, and it's very simply because the Syrian Arab Army and their allies are advancing through eastern Aleppo, and they're routing the US and NATO-backed terrorists that are occupying that area. This is a very important point to make, because the majority of the Western media in the UK as well as in the US are very much portraying Aleppo as a sort of homogenous city. That's not true. We're talking here very clearly the tale of two cities, if you like. Aleppo has been divided by the terrorist invasion that happened around 2012, right from the very beginning, Aleppo has resisted any attempts to pull it into the so-called mythical revolution. And because of that fact, the invasion that happened in 2012 has inflicted punitive measures on Western Aleppo, if you like, because they were responsible for resisting the armed revolution. 600,000 civilians fled from eastern Aleppo into western Aleppo very early on when the terrorists invaded. Those that are left, there's probably around, according to the Aleppo Medical Association that we met with when we went to Aleppo, there's around 200,000, maybe even less now, people left in eastern Aleppo. At least a quarter of that, if not more, are terrorists and their families. The civilians that are in eastern Aleppo, the majority of them are being held hostage. We were given many witness testimonies that stated to us they have family that are still in East Aleppo that are terrified to leave to come into the government-held Western Aleppo, because if they leave, members of their family, their friends, their relations will be murdered by the terrorists. So fundamentally, these terrorists are using these civilians as human shields and then declaring to the media that's accepting their propaganda that these civilians are under threat. The only reason they're under threat is because they're being imprisoned in this area by the terrorists and used as human shields.
You already said something that sort of breaks with the mainstream narrative, because for any rational person, you say that 600,000 people escaped from eastern Aleppo into western Aleppo. Well, if the mainstream narrative is correct, which is that Assad simply enjoys murdering his own people, then why on earth would people go from liberated East Aleppo into the realm of the murderous tyrant Assad in western Aleppo? Something doesn't make sense here.
Absolutely, you've absolutely hit the button. And in fact, what people need to realize is that 90% of the internally displaced people, the people that have been driven out of their towns and villages by the terrorist invasion, the genetically modified terrorists, whatever brand name they're given, they are terrorists. And that's according to the Syrian people. That's not my opinion. But these internally displaced people, 90% have gone into government-held areas for protection. That's over 7 million people that have been displaced inside Syria, that have fled to government-held areas. And let's just also dismantle the whole sectarian idea, because if you go to the coastal areas, for example, like Tartus and Latakia, you will find there are Sunni, there are Alawite, there are Christians, there are all manner of denominations that have fled to that area to cohabit and coexist side by side in taking refuge from the terrorist attacks and massacres that are going on in their homes and villages. So you're absolutely right to make that point. And the other point is there is a huge campaign of dehumanization of the Syrian people by the Western media. Yesterday, I saw that those that are in West Aleppo were being described as Assad supporters. This is a complete lie. These people are not necessarily Assad supporters. They may be against Assad. The difference is they don't believe in killing Syria to improve Syria. And that's a direct quote from one of the doctors working in West Aleppo. That's another point to make. They talk all the time about the last doctor in East Aleppo. They again create this entire campaign about the hospitals and the last doctor in East Aleppo. There are 4,120 doctors working in Aleppo, right? And 200 have joined that number in the last 6 months, registered with the Aleppo Medical Association. And the government has sent doctors from West Aleppo, paying their salaries, into eastern Aleppo to treat not only terrorists, but the civilians that are being held by the terrorists there. And those that have stopped them coming in are the terrorists, the so-called rebels or opposition, as they are described in the Western media. The hospitals, there are 3 main hospitals in East Aleppo, only 3. And there are 7 basic health centers that don't have the facilities to carry out operations and so on. Those 3 hospitals, in Al-Dakak, in Al-Zara, and the Omar Abdulaziz Hospital, which was created by the Grand Mufti Hassoun, are all occupied by terrorists. The top floors are being used as sniping towers. Again, this is not described. and they will treat terrorists as a priority over civilians. The Al-Quds hospital, which has been in the news recently, which, by the way, was destroyed, according to all mainstream media, in April. It was reduced to a smouldering heap, as per their reports, is now suddenly rebuilt in the last few months and is now top of the agenda again in the propaganda. Al-Quds hospital is a terrorist triage center that has been set up by the terrorists. It was visited on the 12th of August, prior to our visit, by Sheikh Abdullah Muhizini, who is the Riyadh-educated and funded leader of Jaish al-Fatah, the Army of Conquest, chief trainer of suicide bombers, and chief terrorist funder, armor, and executor.
Sounds like a nice guy. You know, for anyone who for anyone who might suggest that you're being a little emphatic with your words, calling the East Aleppo terrorists, I would simply remind our viewers that Colonel Steve Warren, who's a Pentagon spokesperson, said not long ago that eastern Aleppo is in the hands of the Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda, which we all recognize as terrorists. They had something to do with something that happened in the U.S. on 9/11. Yet somehow it seems that the U.S. is desperate to protect an area that its own government says is occupied and under siege by al-Qaeda terrorists. You know, you can forgive the viewers for being confused about this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and actually, I can easily forgive the viewers, trust me. Even for me, someone that's been there and has been writing on this for ages now. There's 22, I call them genetically modified terrorists, because we can't call them moderates, we can't call them anything other than terrorists. And again, I have to stress here, that comes from every single Syrian person that I met across the governorates that I traveled to. They do not even consider there is any differentiation between these terrorists. They are all criminals. They are all mass murderers. They are all rapists. They are all torturers. They are all abusers of their children and their families. And yesterday, in fact, you're quite right, 80% of those 200,000 people that are in East Aleppo have been described as being Nusra Front. And yesterday, in fact, while the media was amplifying and megaphoning the propaganda that was being provided to them by the terrorist factions inside East Aleppo, mortars were being rained down upon civilians in West Aleppo. We had descriptions of it being like hell yesterday. There was a 6-year-old child, Pamela, I need to get her name right, Kazanji, who was hit by a mortar. She's 6 years old. She's now paralyzed. And at the same time, the Free Idlib Army, which is, again, the new genetically modified version of the U.S. terrorists that are in Idlib, were firing Bulgarian, among other countries, supplied Grad missiles into northern Aleppo. And one family in Al-Zara, which is in northern Aleppo countryside, 4 of their children from the age of 11 down to 1.5 were dreadfully injured by these missile attacks yesterday. None of this is mentioned. These terrorists that are called rebels, that are called moderate rebels, that are called opposition, are massacring Syrian people. They are not Syrian people who are Assad supporters. They are Syrian people, whether they are Christian, whether they are Shia, whether they are Sunni, whether they are Alawite. Every single one of them will say to you, we are Syrian first and foremost. And we are not here, even if we disagree with our government, we're not here to kill our country in order to improve it.
Yeah, and you know, it might be difficult for a lot of Americans to understand or to believe that its government is siding with terrorists. But, you know, Dr. Paul and I did a show on this, I think, yesterday, where we pointed out this is not unprecedented. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the U.S. very actively supported the Mujahideen, which then became al-Qaeda, bin Laden. So there is a precedent to this, to the U.S. backing terrorists, because the U.S. goal, and I think you'll agree with this, Vanessa, has always been regime change in Syria. Everything else is just for show. The reality is they have got to change the regime in Syria, and that's the goal. But I want to go into the propaganda a little bit, because the propaganda has been like nothing we have ever seen on this, the Western propaganda. And now here's something I know that you know about, because I read your writing about it. And these are the so-called white helmets. And they're portrayed here in the U.S. as selfless humanitarians that rush in the face of danger and save little children from the rubble. And they're always photographed doing this. But there is a different side to these so-called white helmets, and I think you know quite a bit about it, Vanessa.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for bringing them up. As we know, they're sort of being feted and celebrated and iconized, really, as heroes and saviors of humanity. One of the things that I did while I was in Syria, and I did it deliberately as part of my investigation into this group, was I visited the real Syria civil defense in Aleppo, in Tartus, in Latakia, and the headquarters in Damascus, which is right in the Jaish al-Islam territory, very close by to Joba. So they're constantly under attack from terrorist mortar fire and snipers and explosive bullets. What I found out from the real Syria civil defense basically backed up the research that I'd been doing up until then. This is fundamentally, the white helmets, in my opinion, are fundamentally an attempt by the US and by NATO states to create a shadow state inside Syria, which again is a very familiar pattern. They did this in Iraq, and they are definitely doing this in Syria. The white helmets, despite saying that they are an NGO and that they're independent and that they have no funding from interested parties in the conflict in Syria, they're receiving probably now around $100 million at a conservative estimate from the US via USA, 23 million. From the UK, we had Boris Johnson yesterday saying that he was going to up the ante to 32 million pounds. Japan is now involved. Denmark, Holland, Germany the other day confirmed that they would give them 7 million. Holland. So we have a cabal, a sort of a coalition of the white helmets, if you like. And $100 million we're supposed to believe is going to fund 3,000 operatives in a supposed cobbled together humanitarian NGO. This is the kind of money that you put into an army. It's not the kind of money that you put into a very simple NGO. We know for a fact they fabricate evidence. That's been proven in my reports. We know for a fact that they are sectarian. When the Madaya propaganda broke in January 2016, they were photographed calling for the burning and destruction of two Idlib villages, Kafraya and Foua, that have been under siege by the US terrorists, al-Sham, since March 2015, and have lost 1,700 civilians under shelling and sniper fire. And the white helmets were calling for their further destruction. We have numerous photographs showing them armed, showing them basically acting as terrorists, and then quickly putting on the white helmet when they're needed to make another promotional video. I mean, I'm being flippant here, but this is genuinely what is happening. When I spoke to the Syria Civil Defense, the real Syria Civil Defense, and again, I will reiterate, the white helmets are being used to eradicate yet another Syrian state institution, which is the real Syria Civil Defense that has been in existence for 63 years, since 1953. It's registered with the International Civil Defense Organization, which is affiliated to the UN, to the WHO, to OCHA, to Red Cross and Red Crescent. It's a fully certified civil defense organization. So why are the millions not going to this organization to help save civilians in Syria? This organization, the real Syria Civil Defense, is working in both terrorist and civilian areas, and it's rescuing people every day with no recognition from Western media. And not one Western media pundit has gone to visit the real Syria Civil Defense in 5.5 years of war. That's criminal in my book. The white helmets, just very quickly coming back to them, when I spoke to the Syria Civil Defense, particularly in Aleppo, they told me that in 2012, when the terrorists invaded, they took over the real Syria Civil Defense units there. These terrorists then later became the white helmets. One of the crew members of the real Syria Civil Defense that's now in West Aleppo, it gets a little bit convoluted, he told me basically that when they came, they said to him, they threatened him, they said, you have to stay and work with us, you have to help us set this up. He escaped, he left his family behind, he had no choice. When he escaped, the so-called white helmets put his name on all the checkpoints. So if he were to come back to visit his family in East Aleppo, he would be executed. They stole ambulances, all of the ambulances, 3 of their fire engines. They murdered other real civil defense members. They kidnapped others. They drove others out of East Aleppo into West Aleppo. And this is not an isolated incident. Basically, this same procedure happened in Idlib, in Deir ez-Zor, in Raqqa, across Syria, in other words. So, you know, this organization is basically, as far as I'm concerned, they're a terrorist support group. They're acting as terrorists in many instances, and they are terrorists, and yet they're being described by our governments as humanitarian first responders.
Well, they're also described as volunteers. So if all of these guys are volunteers, honestly, where does this $100 million go? I mean, even a super big NGO, even, you know, the Heritage Foundation or something, $100 million goes a long way. Where do you think this money is going? Everyone's a volunteer, yet they've got $100 million.
I think it's a front for funding the arms trade into Syria, to be quite honest. And if you think about it, this is a perfect front. They're first responders. They're traveling backwards. They're trained in Turkey. So they're coming from Turkey into Syria all the time with trucks, with fire engines. If you look at the white helmets in Idlib, their YouTube videos, it's like a parade of all the equipment they're being given by their various sponsors in the EU and in the US. So they're the perfect conduit, they're the perfect artery into the terrorist-held areas to bring in arms, weapons, and equipment. And I believe that this is where this 100 million is going. And by the way, they're also trained by James Le Mesurier, who is a very sort of colorful ex-British military mercenary that has connections back to organizations like Blackwater that are famous for being death squad organizers, basically, for the CIA, and were heavily funded by Bush and then Obama. I think Obama gave around 250 million to Blackwater in order to continue carrying out Blackwater outreach assassination operations. Blackwater became Academy, and then they got merged into various other groups with which James Le Mesurier has very strong contacts. So, you know, this is not some grassroots indigenous humanitarian organization. This is a huge operation that's going on. And not only that, the entire war propaganda, the dirty war on Syria war propaganda, is underpinned by this organization. And so I think this is why we're seeing this incredible rush to give credibility to this organization. And we have to worry about what sort of tool this organization will be in the hands of whoever is elected next in the United States. If it's Hillary Clinton, it's kind of terrifying if these guys get the Nobel Peace Prize. You're talking about terrorists receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a descent into insanity, as far as I can work out.
Well, in all defense, Obama got it, and he's been pretty bad too. So maybe it actually would be appropriate.
Yeah, I think he was a little bit more covert terrorism than perhaps the white helmets are. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, well,
and Kissinger, by the way.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're going to have to close the show out. I could talk about this a lot longer, and I wish we could. But it's so valuable to get information from people on the ground who've actually been there. Even the mainstream journalists, they're reporting from Lebanon and elsewhere. So I just want to thank you very much for coming and sharing with us, and I hope we can have you on again for some more insights. So thank you very much, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for giving me the platform, and thank you so much to your viewers. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of the viewers today for listening to a very different look at Syria, a very different look at how the media portrays things. And I think it's just very important to talk to people that have been there. So let's hope that something changes and that peace will finally come to this poor, beleaguered country. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.